So, what's often missed in critiques of Davanloo's directness is the way he simultaneously works to protect and model autonomy. He doesn't demand submission, he invites collaboration. He brings his full self into the room, not to dominate, but to participate, to share his perspective openly, and to say, in essence, I'm here with you, and I'm going to speak plainly, and you're free to do the same. Hi, everybody. Johannes Keating here. Today, I want to talk about Davanloo's therapeutic stance, whether or not pushiness can coexist with respect for autonomy. We'll be looking at the case of the cement mixer man. I want to focus on a few segments from that case. It's a lesser known earlier case dating back to the late 1970s. Because of that, we see a lot of classic interpretive work, cognitive exploration, investigation into the patient's fantasy life, and detailed examination of triangular, Oedipal conflicts. Now, what makes this case stand out to me is how it highlights a compliant, obsessive-compulsive presentation. Davanloo has often referred to compliance defiance as near universal defenses, but there aren't many transcripts that really showcase how he worked with compliance specifically. So, in that sense alone, this case is incredibly valuable. Using Davanloo's response to the patient's compliance, again, as a springboard, I will expand on a broader discussion of Davanloo's overall therapeutic stance, and I'll try to offer an honest examination of, well, the undeniable fact that part of his method involved being pushy. I'll delve into this aspect and explore how I view it in relation to the importance of safeguarding patient autonomy. Another fascinating element is that the patient actually returns after treatment and ends up watching video recordings of his own therapy and then offers reflective commentary on what he sees. And it's compelling evidence of just how effective and transformative the treatment was, at least to me. You can really tell that this man turned significant corners and that the way he now lives his life is fundamentally different from how he functioned before working with Davanloo. And I think what's especially noteworthy is that this change appears to have occurred. I don't know for sure, but in terms of the transcripts made available here, uh, that the changes appears to have occurred without any traditional unlockings of the unconscious. That should send a strong message to anyone idealizing unlockings or pursuing them in a perfectionistic way, uh, treating them as the only path to transformation is misguided. So it's a powerful reminder that even without dramatic breakthroughs or less flashy clinical work, um, we can still help restructure defenses and we can still facilitate meaningful, lasting change. I was also struck by how Davanloo pursues a given angle, and then at one moment he realizes it's not going to work, and then he follows the patient's lead in finding a different angle to get to a similar destination. So we'll be looking at that passage. It definitely shows Davanloo's flexibility and humility. And this is an important thing here. My intention, my aim in describing Davanloo's work, it's not to encourage imitation, but to support each therapist in finding their own way of integrating what's essential, adapting it into a form that feels authentic, sustainable, and true to your own clinical sensibilities. Okay, that's enough of a preamble. Without further ado, let's get after it. So I'm going to scroll down You can see that the case begins on page 345, the case of the cement mixer man, but I want to get to page 352 here. So I'll just begin right here. Therapist. Let's look at it. Here is a fantasy that goes on for some time. The breasts and the genitals of a woman with no face or other parts. Who is this woman? Patient. It could be any woman. Therapist. Were there other women you had contact with at that age? Patient. No. The only woman I knew was my mother. Therapist. Right here. What do you think now? Patient. Are you saying that these were the genitals and breasts of my mother? Therapist. Tell me what you think yourself. Patient. Obviously, it must have been my mother, but I had never seen her genitals. Therapist. Do you notice that in talking about fantasies and many other memories, somehow you prefer not to volunteer information and you put me in a position of questioning you? Patient. I just want to get to one point. You said I force you to draw things out of me, and this is exactly what was in my mind a moment ago. Okay. And then there's commentary right here, beginning here. Okay. In this part of the interview, the patient expresses the idea that some of these things are very difficult to talk about. And this is followed by some transferential material. The therapist finally points out to the patient that he somehow finds it difficult to expose his intimate thoughts and ideas. He's pointing out the patient's conflict around emotional intimacy. Then the patient says there are things he wants to talk about, but that the therapist might say he's changing the subject. Okay, so we'll resume the transcript right here. Therapist, there is a fear that I might cut you off. Patient, yes, a fear that I'm not proceeding in the way you think best. Therapist, do you think this might be somewhat similar to your relationship with your father? The idea that I be the one to direct you? Many times you indicated that you wanted to please him, and everything you did was directed to please your father. You even chose your career to please him. Now, you were talking about your earliest memories. So here we have the patient's compliance coming into bold relief. We see that he discloses a conflict around trying to manage the relationship with Davanloo for fear of not pleasing him. When the patient first asks Davanloo, are you saying that these were the genitals and breasts of my mother? We see that Davanloo blocks this attempt to defer to Davanloo with a simple, tell me what you think yourself. Then the patient discloses his fear of not pleasing Davanloo. And that's the key. The patient is conscious of this and he shares this apparently in a spontaneous way. So this means that the patient is not blindly acting out his urge to please Davanloo. He instead has some distance from it. He verbalizes it, and that's an act of collaboration. He is letting Davanloo in on the defense, which means that the defense is not in total dominion. So, in my opinion, this is why Davanloo deals with it through investigation. Do you think this is somewhat similar to your relationship with your father? The idea that I be the one to direct you. Okay. So he goes to the triangular person and he makes this link to the past. And this conveys Davanloo's faith that the collaboration has the upper hand over the defense. Had the patient simply acted out his people pleasing, this kind of inquiry and linking to the past, it would not be effective. Also noteworthy is that Davanloo's initial blocking of the defense of passivity and deferring to Davanloo, his comment of, tell me what you think yourself. This did not seem to exacerbate the compliance in the sense of reinforcing the blind enactment of the compliance, but instead it led the patient to further articulate this urge to people please. So, to my mind, this means that the patient was becoming more conscious of the defense and more conscious of the underlying conflict, and that the UTA was growing in strength, as evidenced by the fact that the patient shares all of this with Davanloo. The patient shared that, quote, there are things that he wants to talk about, but fears that Davanloo, will basically accuse him of changing the subject, end of quote. So I say this because I can picture some people thinking that Davanloo's somewhat forceful blocking would itself inflame the compliance. Davanloo is essentially telling the patient what to do. He says, tell me what you think yourself. That is a directive. But rather than trying to render himself into a wallflower in the face of the patient's compliance, we see that Davanloo allows his own presence, his own views to very much be part of the interaction. One of the most powerful repellents and disinfectants of transference and projective phenomena in general is the skillful use of the real relationship. Patients will basically engage their characterological defenses and customary transferences almost regardless of what the therapist does or doesn't do. That's precisely why they're called characterological. These defenses are deeply woven into the patient's personality and central to how they operate in relationships. The idea that a therapist must hide all of their personal preferences in order to avoid triggering compliance, it's not an idea that Davanloo subscribed to. On the contrary, he seemed to believe that a certain kind of self-disclosure could actually help dismantle both compliance and defiance. What comes to mind is the portion of Davanloo's head-on collision that's designed to undermine defiance. He'd say something like, sure, I don't like to fail, and it would be sad if we said goodbye here in an atmosphere of defeat, but I can afford to fail. How would it be for you if this fails? That's a classic Davanloo move, right? He's being honest about his reaction and preferences, and then pivoting to the larger perspective, which is basically, look, I don't like what's happening here. I don't like that you put this wall up, but I can live with it. Right? You're the one that stands to lose a lot more. So that kind of honesty, it often drains the power out of both compliance and defiance. Now, hiding his preferences, on the other hand, would likely worsen them, in my opinion. So I realized that what I'm really starting to speak about here is Davanloo's foundational stance. And it's a stance that's been criticized over the years as too directive, too controlling, or even coercive or bullying. And honestly, I'm sure there were moments when some of those critiques were justified. Anytime a therapist adopts a more active stance, especially one that abandons the illusion of impartiality, it opens the door for potential missteps. But I think it's a real shame when that potential for misuse leads people to dismiss the stance altogether. A more neutral or passive posture, it can also create significant problems, especially in the face of defenses such as projections that actually thrive in ambiguity. Now, when it comes to page 343, the beginning of this text, let me read this piece because this is something that I essentially disagree with Davanloo about. I think it's here. The major task of the therapist is to understand as quickly as possible the essential problems and make them understandable to the patient. Yeah, well, that I agree with. The therapist is much more active than in classical psychoanalysis, and I very much agree with the statement of Dr. Lowy that there is no place for a passive therapist in this kind of treatment. He very nicely indicated that, quote, we cannot wait for the material to bubble up, end of quote. So I understand that Davanloo is trying to differentiate himself from traditional psychoanalysis, but I think he goes a little too far with his statement. I've had sessions where remaining silent for extended stretches was critical. It was essential for a number of reasons, but especially for undoing defiance and demonstrating that what I had just said in the head-on collision about the session grinding to a halt, that this was not just some throwaway line, but an actual experienced, observable reality, right? If I just kept talking, then that would dilute the whole head-on collision that was just said, right? So there's all kinds of reasons for why silence can be a very powerful, effective intervention. So there's that. I mean, if Davanloo is equating silence with passivity, yeah, then I simply disagree. But if he's rejecting a kind of emotional detachment or disengagement by the therapist, a therapist who isn't genuinely involved, that's a different matter entirely. And in that case, I would agree with him. This is such an important topic that I want to spend a few more minutes on it. Earlier, as we were looking at page 352, let me pull that up again. Right? When Davanloo says here in the pink, tell me what you think yourself. That's how he was blocking the patient's passivity, compliance, wanting to defer to Davanloo. So that's just one small example of his more active and directive style. And I want to try to describe this style or this therapeutic stance in broader terms. In my estimation, Davanloo maintained active participation throughout the therapy process. It doesn't mean he was never silent. Some of the transcripts actually showcase through commentary, silence in parentheses. So keep in mind that when I talk about participation, that can leave room for a silent therapist. But anyway, Davanloo, he didn't hide behind a wall of impartiality. He didn't detach himself in the name of clinical objectivity. Instead, we see his transparent involvement, his willingness to be seen, to speak directly, and to guide the work with conviction. He brings his presence and point of view into the room, not as a distraction from the work, but as an essential part of it. His statements and interventions reflect his clinical intentions and values, showing a therapist who knows what he's aiming for and isn't afraid to pursue it. And woven throughout, we see his preferences, what matters to him in the therapeutic encounter, and how he believes real change takes place when both therapist and patient are fully engaged. And this is key. The therapeutic stance that makes room for the therapist's views and values does not give the therapist license to act inappropriately or lose sight of the fact that it's the patient's best interests that matter. The therapist's behavior, of course, must remain within the bounds of informed consent and professional ethics. But anyway, this is at its core a therapeutic stance rooted in the real relationship. And again, I want to be clear. My intention in describing Davanloo's stance isn't to encourage anyone to become a clone of Davanloo. Instead, I see real value in studying how he worked, not to imitate him, but to be inspired by him, to aim to integrate what resonates into forms that feel true or authentic and sustainable for each of us as individual therapists. Now I'm going to read a few excerpts from the transcript that illustrate this stance, and I have jotted them down on a separate piece of paper, so I'm actually not going to try to find them here on this PDF that we're all looking at right now, but you can look it up yourself or take my word for it. But on page 350, there's several instances of Davanloo saying, let's look at it. On page 354, it's very important for us to understand this method. Okay, in reference to something the patient was doing, not the method of the therapy. Page 357. Now, let's see what the guilt feelings were. Now, let's see what it was. Page 359. Why perhaps? Is it or isn't it? Page 360. Let's see what you remember as a child about your mother. And isn't it interesting that you don't want to look at those fantasies? Page 361. If all of these things were coincidental, you wouldn't be here. So, can we say that Davanloo tends to be a bit pushy in the sense of being insistent? Yes, I think that is a fair characterization. He does tend to push in the sense of repeatedly raising something and insisting that the patient look at it or considers what it is that he's raising. But it's crucial to understand that this pushiness, it exists within a framework where he's also deeply committed to preserving the patient's autonomy. I've highlighted this in other videos, where in one form or another, Davanloo is repeatedly saying things like, I hope you don't just agree with me, but for you to decide for yourself. And and he's very focused on whether or not the patient functions autonomously or not. Like I'm thinking about the case of the angry childlike woman. That's a good example. So anyway, at the heart of Davanloo stands is a kind of mutual contract. We're both free agents here. You need to be free to speak your mind with me, and I need that same freedom in return. Obviously, through the prism of trying to help the patient, not to satisfy personal needs. So, Davanloo, he claims that freedom unapologetically. We see it in his relentless efforts to hold up a mirror to the patient to say, take a look at yourself, or look at this idea that I'm putting forth. He sees it as part of his job to say, here's how it looks to me, but how does it look to you? This marks a radical departure from the idea that a therapist must be an impartial, opaque wallflower, constantly withholding input to avoid contaminating the patient's or undermining the patient's autonomy. Of course, concerns about safeguarding autonomy are not baseless. They are important. But in Davanloo's model, helping the patient feel free, it actually involves modeling that freedom by fully being himself. So what we see in Davanloo is not an authoritarian stance where the therapist assumes they always know best and they dictate from above. It's rather an authoritative one. He speaks with conviction, yes, but also with curiosity and responsiveness. An authoritative stance makes room for the therapist's voice without eclipsing the patient's. It insists on participation, not submission. And part of what's meant by authoritative here is the idea that the therapist is entitled to an opinion, an informed, experience-based point of view, and does not need to be apologetic about it. That stance does not negate humility. On the contrary, it often requires humility, the willingness to pivot, to acknowledge when a line of inquiry isn't working, and to follow the patient's lead when a more fruitful path presents itself. So if we assume that less is always more, that any therapist's self-expression will invariably spark or reinforce a power struggle, and that neutrality alone safeguards patient autonomy, if we view all human interaction as nothing more than a stage for oppressive power dynamics, we'll never truly appreciate what Davanloo brought to the table. And if that's your jam, right, if the distinction between authoritarian and authoritative, if that doesn't strike you as all that meaningful, if any form of therapist assertion feels inherently problematic, then you might feel more at home in postmodern approaches like, if I remember from grad school, like narrative therapy or intersubjective psychoanalysis. I think if memory serves, and I'm not 100 on this, but I think these modalities, they emphasize co-constructed meaning, and they often prioritize decentralizing the therapist's voice. So that might be more for you if this doesn't appeal to you. But Davanloo was working from a very different map of the human psyche indeed, one that assumes the therapist must sometimes, if not often, take a stand. not to dominate, but to help the patient face what they've spent a lifetime avoiding. Now, this brings to mind another figure who deeply understood the necessity of personal presence in therapy, Harry Guntrip. In chapter 8 of Schizoid Phenomena, Object Relations and the Self from 1968. This one, I have it pulled up right here. So here, let me read a few excerpts from here. All right, so this is a beautiful, beautiful chapter. I'm just going to read some highlights. No one will be saved from profound personality disturbance by talking to an impersonal projection screen. Over here. All this cannot go on unless the therapist is a real person himself or herself, giving the patient the possibility of a real relationship in the treatment situation over and above the transference relations. These can come out more openly on the basis of a steadily deepening realistic confidence of the patient in the therapist, without which the patient will let out very little, however correct the technique. And lastly, if the therapist persists in being, in reality, a merely objective scientific intelligence with no personal feeling for the patient, he will repeat on the patient the original emotional trauma suffered at the hands of parents, which laid the foundations of the illness. It's hard to imagine a better description of what Davanloo was doing. Not an impersonal technician, but as a human being with convictions, presence, and a willingness to be known in the service of the patient's liberation. Okay, I want to shift gears now and look at a juncture in the transcript where Davanloo is trying to make a case for the idea that the patient ought to have resentment towards him on account of Davanloo being late. And the patient pushes back against this, but then offers a different point of entry into the same or similar idea, avoided anger towards Davanloo. So this takes place page 364, 365, 366. 364, 5, and 6. So here in the 10th session, and I will just read. So starting here, therapist. In any other relationship, you experience resentment, except here, patient. But the thing is that I'm coming here because I want to be helped. Therapist. That's the intellectual aspect of it, but I'm saying that in any other relationship, you resent to be told. Yet here you invite me to tell you what to do. And then you say that if I tell you what to do, you don't have any feelings about it. Patient. Okay, so why is that? Why is it that you can separate the intellectual part from the emotional and I can't? I don't see the difference. I'm going to react according to the way it strikes me intellectually. Therapist. Let's look at this morning. You came to the session as if nothing happened, even though I was late. Patient. But you see, I know the problems of getting into town at 8 in the morning. I come in every morning. Up here now, therapist. So then what you're talking about again is the intellectual. But what I'm looking at is, what did you feel while you were waiting for quite some time until I got here? Patient. For the most part, I didn't feel anything. I was reading. The time went by fast. Therapist, and we're right here. Let's look at it. If things are not precise in moments at home with your wife, you get irritated. You're restless. You're angry. Either you withdraw, don't talk with your wife, or you rave around. But then you're here at 8 a.m., and I'm 15, 20 minutes late, and it's an entirely different reaction. If you take the intellectual aspect of it, you could say the same thing about your wife. Here you say that the traffic is heavy, or all sorts of ideas. Patient. Yes, but I wouldn't get mad at my wife for that either. Therapist. But you have repeatedly told me that. Patient. Not for that type of a thing. Therapist. And we're right here. That if things are not done on time, even at a party, if things were to be ready at 5 and it's 5:30, during the time from 5 to 5:30, you're completely disorganized, irritated, and you take over the activities of your wife. Didn't you tell me this? Patient, yes, I did. You say 5:30, we're supposed to be ready at 5 and it's 5:30 and nothing is done. If I don't begin, it could very easily be 6:30. Therapist. But I'm talking right now about here. See, again, you're moving away from this issue of your reaction in relationship with me and your reaction with your wife or others. Patient, I don't know why I don't feel. First of all, I don't see the similarity between waiting 15 minutes and having a disagreement with my wife over something that reoccurs. It constantly reoccurs, the things that I argue over with my wife. Therapist, in a way, what you're saying is this, that when you waited there 15 minutes, you didn't have any ideas or any feelings about it. Patient, not feelings. I had some ideas. Therapist, what sort of ideas? Patient, well, maybe that the technician didn't make it, or you didn't make it. You've made appointments for 8:15 and not 8, and so I feel that anytime between 8 and 8:15, I can expect the therapy to begin. I feel that even if I arrive, therapist, then here, in a sense, all your thoughts have to do with a protective pattern in relationship with me. In other words, I made an appointment at 8:15 and then you were the one who made the mistake and came at 8. Patient, no, not today. I knew you said 8 today. Therapist, and I'm talking about today. Patient, actually, I think that's a poor example. I think a better example would be how I don't argue with you when you present a point that I feel I disagree with. I used to sit there and say yes. Therapist, you did. Yeah. So let's look at that. Patient, I guess it has to do with authority. My father, I guess he knows best. You know best. Once I have your approval, I can proceed without any guilt, I suppose. Therapist. So in a way, you're saying that if you disagree or you initiate things, you feel guilty. Yes. Therapist, and we're down here now. This is very important if this is so. In a way, what you're saying is this, that if you disagree with me or put out ideas that are different from mine, or you assert your views or initiate, then you feel guilty. Is that it? Patient. I don't know. I would think it's more the fear of doing something wrong for which I'll be guilty later. It's a guilt fear thing. Therapist. Because these things are connected with each other in a sense. Patient. Like with my wife, I feel I need to tell her everything I do because if I don't tell her, I do feel guilty. I feel that I've betrayed her. If I don't tell her, I feel guilty. Okay. And then Davanloo goes on, yes, but it has to do with this. All of them, in a sense, are similar. That you have to get another person's okay with what you do. You have to get your wife to agree that the front door is all right. You want to take it off, and then she agrees with it. But any other activity, somebody has to okay it. And this was one of the areas of conflict that you also had with your in-laws, that in a sense you have overcome some of these things, but you would invite them to give their opinion. You wanted them to okay things. And you do the same thing here. This is similar also to the issues of the disagreement because it's the idea of asserting your views and putting out your views. In a way, what you say is that you feel guilty if you're spontaneous or initiative or if you're active. Remember the first few sessions with me? We worked with this issue that you constantly wanted me to be questioning you, leading you, and directing you, as if in a way there's something about this that in all of them a thread goes in all of these areas. Namely, you cannot assert your views and you cannot be autonomous in terms of your own actions. And then here, patient. I would imagine that guilt and fear must be close together because in some areas I know it's guilt that motivates me, and in other areas I know it's fear that motivates me, fear of doing the wrong thing. Okay, and so on and on. So you saw here how Davanloo really went for this one angle right? And eventually gave up on it in the face of the patient continuously pushing back and then going with the angle that the patient proposed, which was that in previous sessions, the patient would not argue when he disagreed with Davanloo. We see that this does not move towards anger, towards Davanloo. And in fact, if I were to keep reading from the transcript, you would see it. I'm not going to do that. But what ends up happening is that Davanloo just gives up on trying to get the patient to look at potentially avoided anger towards Davanloo, but instead it leads to the patient's hostility towards women. Essentially, they begin to flesh out the patient's misogyny. So this shows Davanloo's flexibility and willingness to change course. He just dropped the whole thing about getting the patient to see his hostility towards him, and the session went in a pretty different direction. So, in closing, the case of the cement mixer man, it offers a rich glimpse into Davanloo's distinctive stance, one that is undeniably active, often insistent, and sometimes, uncomfortable to read or watch. But when seen in context, it becomes clear that his pushiness is not about control for its own sake. It's about urgency. It's about taking the patient's suffering seriously enough to insist that they engage with it honestly, unflinchingly. So, what's often missed in critiques of Davanloo's directness is the way he simultaneously works to protect and model autonomy. He doesn't demand submission, he invites collaboration. He brings his full self into the room, not to dominate, but to participate, to share his perspective openly, and to say, in essence, I'm here with you, and I'm going to speak plainly, and you're free to do the same. So, whether we agree with every move Davanloo made or not, what this case demonstrates is that change doesn't always require dramatic unlockings. Sometimes the real relationship, the sustained pressure against character defenses, and the therapist's willingness to show up authentically, that this allows for the deep restructuring of the defenses to take place. Okay, thanks for joining me for this exploration. If you found it helpful or thought-provoking, feel free to check out my other videos on Davanloo's work and the broader landscape of ISTDP. Thanks again, and see you next time.